What's better, a corrupt democracy or a benevolent autocracy? This is just one of the major ideas that Legends of the Galactic Heroes asks you to think about. If you like stories that explore human nature, I can guarantee you're going to love this. You might have seen pictures of some of these characters going around, especially Reinhard von Lohengramm, on people's profile pictures here and there. And now that I've watched the whole series, I can finally understand why people love it and its characters. I want you to know that this video will contain spoilers for the series, but I'll try to avoid naming names when it comes to specific events. So, even though I'll be talking about plot details, other than the obvious stuff that you could guess from the very start, you won't have to worry about me spoiling exactly what happens. This story is based on a series of sci-fi novels written by Yoshiki Tanaka. Now, I haven't read the books, but you can tell that it's based on books. It's hard to explain unless you experience it for yourself, the dialogue and narration, but once you do, it's very clear. If you want to watch the series completely blind, as in you've heard of the name or seen some screenshots, but want to know absolutely nothing, I'll just give you some very short pitches for it right here. Legends of the Galactic Heroes is Star Wars, but you're rooting for the Empire. Legends of the Galactic Heroes is what happens when someone writes a Griffith-type character as a good guy. I can say without a doubt that this is among the greatest space operas and greatest stories in all of fiction, and one that truly lives up to the name of its genre. It is 110 episodes long, plus OVAs, but I promise that every single piece is relevant to the whole story and is worth it. The writing is tight, and there are basically no loose threads left over. The characters in episode 100 will recall things all the way back in episode 1, and you can remember those events with them. Everything matters here. The sense of time passing and the characters aging is also very well done. The length of the series feels relevant to the plot, since the characters growing older and learning from their pasts plays into how they develop, as well as the themes of the show. The entire thing is one massive conversation between representatives of autocracy and democracy. Is a good and benevolent king better than a clearly corrupt, rotting group of democratically elected rulers? Would you stick to your guns and fight for democracy even if the masses are objectively better under an absolute ruler? How can you even fight for the rule of the people without rising above them automatically in the first place to make your views known? And wouldn't naturally becoming a great hero that commands them defeat the point of democracy in the first place? So beyond some of these amazing questions that Galactic Heroes asks, the anime never explicitly answers them. Not by itself. It truly respects its audience's intelligence, and that's something I feel like a lot of shows are missing these days. It's got multiple fleshed out protagonists, and is a grand, literally galaxy-spanning epic. You could say the story is just one big political drama, but it's so well written that you can't skip a single sentence. I came out of the show with a new view on politics as a whole, or more accurately, a new perspective on democracy versus autocracy. My interpretation ended up being that the people running the government matter more than the style of governance. Discussing the show as a real-life audience member already involves you in the debate started by the fictional characters, and being placed on the level of these characters rather than being placed above them when discussing the themes of the show is a sign of fantastic character writing, in my opinion. Now, don't let the fact that Legends of the Galactic Heroes is about politics fool you into thinking you'll be bored while watching. The dated visuals fade into the background quite early on, so if you're worried about that, if you really get into the show, you won't have to be, because the world building and visual design draw you in pretty quickly. Not to mention that the characters, not the politics, are the driving force of this show. Since you get invested in the characters, you get invested in their views on things, and they just so happen to talk about war, history, and politics. Even if you don't know much about Legends of the Galactic Heroes, you've definitely heard of it if you're in the anime space. The two main factions are the Galactic Empire and the Free Planet Alliance. And as the show went on, I found myself cheering more for the Empire and less for the Alliance. The show tells us why this happens, though you may be on the other side in your personal experience. A key line from this show that really stuck with me is, people don't follow ideals, people follow people. They follow leaders, either appointed or naturally occurring. You as the viewer are not invulnerable to this. You may start on the side of Yang Wen-li and the Alliance, but the more invested you get into Reinhard von Lohengramm and his quest to the top, to make sure that corrupt nobles can never again abuse the weak, and to rule the universe as a promise to his best friend, Yang's plot becomes a little less interesting. And then, the closer you get to the end of the show, the more you just start waiting for Reinhard to win. So you may have started the show on the side of Republican democracy, but by the end, you're on the side of absolute monarchy. The show is basically about two great men of history, Yang and Reinhard, genius strategists who are responsible for moving things forward, for defining their universe's history. Without them, the show's events just wouldn't happen or would remain stagnant. The show calls this the flow of history. Both factions would be stuck in place. In case you're unfamiliar, the great man theory states that history is shaped by a few exceptional individuals, like for example Napoleon, George Washington, and so on, people whose names you know. The show frames itself as a telling of history. There's a narrator throughout every episode that gives the show this documentary-like feel. He lists off dates and times, and generally speaks in a very matter-of-fact way about things. That really adds to the sense that these characters are, or were, real people, with lives that begin and end just like the side characters. No one is invulnerable to the flow of time, to the endless march of history. There is no plot armor, there's just a matter of what side you're on, how high you can climb due to your talents, and how deeply you're involved in this era of history. The fact that the show is decently long lets characters who seem irrelevant at first develop into side characters, and then into main characters. It's an awesome way to add to the sense of realism. Protagonists themselves change place. I will tell you this, Galactic Heroes is without a doubt about Reinhard. He is the central character throughout the whole thing. The show itself describes him as a star or sun, as an existence that the galaxy revolves around. He and Yang Wen-li are the two, central great men, the defining characters of the show, no matter who else joins the cast. And the reason these characters and ideologies feel so grounded is because the show treats the whole world building with the same realism. It's hard sci-fi. Everything is pretty realistic and holds up to the show's own internal logic. I think the dated animation actually works in its favor. The characters have realistic limits. For example, in some cases, they can't survive wounds that they would have walked off if they were in other shows. Even if their deaths are grand and dramatic in context, major characters can get taken out in very simple and realistic ways when you really look at how it happens. Here's one example. There are instances of major characters getting shot in the middle of an episode, and that's all it takes to end show-long plot lines. That's it. The best part about the writing is that no matter the fate that each character meets, good or bad, it never feels lame or subversive. I may have said this before. When it comes to fiction, execution is everything. So, thanks to the show's amazing soundtrack and how it treats itself like a space opera, things that would otherwise feel cheap feel well earned here. Like I said earlier in the video, you feel like you're watching a documentary, but other times you feel like you're watching a play or listening to a legend. It's a great balance between the two that lets Legends of the Galactic Heroes feel like real events and like a story that's been passed down to you. There's an OVA called My Conquest is the Sea of Stars, which is a remake of about the first 2 episodes, and the beginning of that OVA really set the tone for me because I watched that instead of the first 2 episodes. For all its majesty, the events of Legend of the Galactic Heroes are framed as just one part of this endless cycle of peace and war that is the whole of human history. The characters, locations, and factions in the beginning of the show are going to be totally unrecognizable by the end. In that sense, the world building is one of the most realistic in all of anime, if not all of fiction. I'm not, playing it up. It's really unique. I think you'll also really like the visual design. A big part of the show is that history repeats itself, and like I said, this story treats itself like a piece of our future history. The Galactic Empire, for example, is influenced by older monarchies from our world and empires in general. Its outfits and ships have a very distinct look, and while the Alliance has its own aesthetic, it feels a little more generic. The show defines its characters and their ideologies through aesthetics, and it's one of the most powerful tools any story or real-life group can have. Even before hearing any dialogue, you can get a sense for what each faction, or in some cases, each character is like. The Galactic Empire reminds me of the Romans because, for example, they have pillars inside their ships, which by itself is a crazy design choice that separates the show from a lot of other sci-fi out there. You may have also noticed that their uniforms are all very ornate, down to the regular foot soldiers. And that's not even talking about the classic European noble-style dress that the civilian characters have. The ruler of the empire is referred to as the Kaiser, and in general, they don't have any clean-cut militaristic look to them. Instead, the empire is very fancy. Their uniforms are all quite detailed and shimmering silver and black. It's nothing like the Hugo Boss 1940s collection if, you're one of those guys that's worried about that and instantly filters themselves out of the show. Instead, to me, it evokes feelings of a much, much older age. And this is something the show as a whole does. It feels very ancient in the best way. Towards the end of the show, and this isn't a plot spoiler, the main Empire characters all get colored capes, and it's a really good look for them. Personally, seeing Kaiser Reinhard at his peak made me think of paintings of Napoleon. It proves that no matter the era, cloaks, capes, and swords are peak male fashion. Going back to the show's aesthetics, let's compare the Empire to the other side, the Free Planets Alliance. The Alliance is basically this show's version of the Star Wars Rebel Alliance. When looking at their ships and overall appearance, I actually thought of Vietnam-era American soldiers. Both factions have these smaller fighter ships, and you can definitely see the X-Wing in these Alliance dogfighters. They're literally wearing X-Wing suits, and doing the Vietnam-style graffiti on helmets thing, but for their ships. And then you've got the civilians wearing regular suits, t-shirts, and jeans. The show, to me, is essentially the US versus Germany, aesthetics-wise. Although I have heard another comparison claiming that the Empire represents Imperial Japan and the Alliance represents modern Japan. I'm telling you guys, if you love history, you're going to be a big fan of the anime. Even if you're not, it'll give you a new frame of reference to see our world from. And again, doing that well, where you can enjoy it as a self-contained thing and see all the connections to our world, is the mark of an objectively good story to me. I'm sure many of you will be able to draw even more parallels to history in the show than I can. The fates of specific characters, and how their actions impact the war, may also remind you of events in our past, but I'll avoid talking about those in detail for those of you who want to go in basically blind. You'll notice that a lot of main characters, but specifically Yang Wen-li and Reinhard von Lohengramm, make it a point to learn from their own history. Both our real-world past, which did occur in their world, and the recent history of the show's fictional future. Speaking of which, even the show's future feels very plausible. It's just a natural progression, because we get space travel, but that doesn't mean that it changes how nations interact over time. It's just history, but on a larger scale than ever before. Planets are regarded as cities, and entire sections of galaxies are now just nations. Rather than capital cities, you're going to see capital planets, and the way that these planets are talked about in the dialogue makes it feel like everyone's just talking about cities. And these characters live in a world where, to them, having billions of humans across the Milky Way is just how things are. The way characters speak about the world, normalizing these things, is another fantastic way to immerse the audience. This realism also extends to the social structures of these factions. One thing that may not be obvious at first glance is how much Galactic Heroes feels like a story straight out of medieval Europe. You've got emperors, nobles, knights, and sprawling empires. The empire itself is a monarchy with court intrigue, succession concerns, elite warrior orders, and the alliance is the more democratic sort of kingdom, with debates, elections, and political maneuvering. If you love stories about kings and queens, the rise and fall of empires, and knights and chivalry, you'll recognize a lot of the same appeal here. And on the other hand, if you like more modern stories about government, you have the alliance side of this tale. Basically, Legend of the Galactic Heroes is partially a retelling of the stories that drew people to medieval epics for centuries. Just the main difference being is that we're looking to the future and we're in space now. I've talked about the aesthetics of the show a lot, but I want you to know that its influences are not just surface level. The medieval influences, for example, they shape how people fight, and as you all know, I'm always on the hunt for cool melee battles in fiction. Given how old the show is and how basic its animation is, it might surprise you to know that one of my favorite aspects is its fights. And I don't just mean its ship battles. I mean that you're going to see conflicts between armored soldiers. Although these are few and far between compared to the ship battles, which are how most fights happen, these melee fights are very memorable. They introduce us to the best martial artists in the show, the Rosenritter. These guys, whose name translates as Knights of the Rose, are the elite. There is no one in the entire show who can really stand up to them, all the way to the very end of the series. And beyond the Rosenritter, the armored legions in general are really just knights. Although the armor is different, and these are all clearly spacemen, they still fight with battle axes in corridors, courtyards, and so on. What's even crazier is that they still carry pistols in some cases. The show never lets you forget that it is science fiction in the best way. I keep coming back to the design of the weapons, ships, and armor just because it's hard sci-fi done really well. Everyone carries laser guns that run on battery packs, and I love that these are literal laser guns, as in a character might die while holding the trigger down, and the laser just keeps going and burns a line through a wall. Laser guns. The armor feels weighty, which is awesome, but it's not invulnerable. It can get chopped through pretty easily by other armored fighters. And at the same time, it's hard to explain without actually looking at photos of it, but you can see a clear connection between the show's armor and astronaut outfits. Through the armored guys, we see the importance of aesthetics again. The Empire's fighters have the classic Killzone, Jinro, Red-Eye Death Squad look, while the Alliance has a more expressive and colorful, but somehow also plainer look to their armor. In case you're wondering why they're not using the pretty overpowered laser guns more, it's because Galactic Heroes has something like the Holtzman shields from Dune. Legend of Galactic Heroes introduces something called Zephyr particles. To summarize, these are combustible particles, meaning if anybody fires an energy weapon near them, everything explodes, and everyone's cooked. As a result, we get these awesome melee fight scenes whenever these Zephyr particles are deployed. I'll actually talk about Dune in this video, as I also count it as a space opera. Both Dune and Galactic Heroes have massive universes, with their stories sprawling across space and time. But Galactic Heroes is a little closer to our time, and a little closer to the ground, if that makes sense. There's no space magic here. Although there aren't actually one-on-one duels in Galactic Heroes, at least not in the main series, all the fights involving the Rosenritter or Armored Grenadiers will instantly transport you to a realm of chivalry. I'm telling you, you're in for a treat whenever they're on screen. It's a small group of extremely well-trained men striking fear into the hearts of others. With the Zephyr particles around, there's nowhere you can run, no higher technology to rely on. You're suddenly stuck with just your skills and training, and that's now the only thing determining whether you can actually survive an encounter with these guys. Not to mention, there's also one fight where you see the Empire's armored soldiers walk into a base and just tank tons of laser pistol fire, just mowing these guys down with axes. It's basically that one scene from the Warhammer episode of Secret Level, just with choppier animation. You'll have to accept that, by the way, you won't get JJK tier Sakuga, especially not overworked MAPPA animator levels. You just have to lower your expectations overall, as this show is from the 80s, and it is still mostly people talking. There are moments where the animation suddenly jumps in quality, like dogfights or melee fights, and I want to keep those a pleasant surprise to you. I've been talking about how grand and large Galactic Heroes is and a lot of its looks, but it also tells you how to behave as an individual. For example, there's a guy named Oberstein, a character who has a clear code of conduct, but he's exceedingly cold to his fellow man. I interpret him as an example of going too far in the direction of the needs of the many. On the other hand, you have the sniveling rat, Job Trunit, who manipulates the more honorable characters like Yang Wenli repeatedly for political gain. Trunit will agree with anyone, any system, as long as it benefits him. It's not the needs of the few. He's so self-centered that it's the needs of the self. And then, after these guys, you have the two big dogs, Reinhard and Yang. While Reinhard fully accepts his role as a great man, and even jumps up to claim it, Yang repeatedly runs from it throughout the show. Reinhard seeks to define the world around him, to carve his name into history, and Yang just wants to fight for an ideal, not for any particular person. That's why you may find yourself rooting for the Empire more, because Reinhard is much more eager to step up. But when it comes to Yang, he's fighting for his ideals too. He just doesn't want to become the Alliance equivalent of Reinhard, which, as the show goes on, becomes basically inevitable in its own way. It doesn't really happen how you'd think, but both these guys end up as great men in their own ways. And thinking back on it, both do get what they want. In terms of their personalities, regardless of which one you like more, both are set up as honorable men. They're kind to their friends and subordinates, but are also able to zoom out and see the big picture. So, when necessary, they can focus on their families and friends, but they will act for the good of their factions. A balance is needed. Not to mention, the trait they both share of staying calm in extremely stressful situations is really what elevates them. Some version of this is what Legend of the Galactic Heroes presents as being the ideal man. The best part is that both these characters express these traits in different ways, so you are not limited to one template. And like I said about changing protagonists, you have other characters who are positively influenced by these two for even more examples of honorable men and women who can make it through tough situations and adapt to a changing universe. Another thing the show puts out is that the best kinds of people seek a better tomorrow. They set the world up so that their children and younger members of society don't have to suffer. The best old characters, for example, will spare younger members of their crews, sending them away to safety as their ships explode. The protagonists, even when they switch sides or know that they're enemies, always have some degree of fair play. To be a trickster or a slippery manipulator is pretty much universally hated. You, as an audience member, will root for both sides. It's just a matter of which one you like more. Don't get me wrong, there is a faction of real villains out there, but to know who they are is a big spoiler, so I'm not going to tell you. Since we're talking about space operas, I'd like to compare the themes of Galactic Heroes to Dune. Both stories have a different perspective on the idea of leadership. Whereas Frank Herbert's own interpretation of Dune is basically that heroes should come with a warning label, that you should be wary of great men of history, Galactic Heroes says that these great men, the ones with the will, the intelligence, the power, the luck to show up at the right time in the right place, they're the only ones who can actually turn the wheel of history. They are entirely necessary for positive change. Out with the old, in with the new. That's another big theme. Galactic Heroes warns against a society's death by gerontocracy. The evil old men try to Chrono-style eat their young and up-and-coming fighters, while the good old men prioritize the next generation's survival and guide them to carry the torch and become great. If you try and stop history, it'll run you over with even more speed. You're pretty much just guaranteed to lose. Great men can appear even when the spirits of previously regular men are activated by the sudden desire to conquer, to make their name known. If you've seen the show, you know which guy I'm talking about towards the end of the story. Otherwise, great men are just naturally made by the circumstances around them, like Julian. I'm going off how they pronounce it. Another thing about this anime is that it's got tons of different genres within. With Julian, it's a shonen coming-of-age story with some romance. With the big dogs, it's a bigger seinen about politics, history, and a battle of wits and ideas. And then, in general, Legend of the Galactic Heroes is a political drama, and with certain evil guys, who I'm not going to name yet, it becomes a mystery thriller conspiracy show. This sort of mix is also what makes it great, and the length of the show is what lets it breathe and makes it all fit together. Going back to Dune and how it interprets great men, Paul is presented as a tragic figure. Both he and Reinhard start off as nobles, actually, and go on to conquer their universes. But they do this in different ways, as Dune has way more of a religious messiah story going on, but you can draw similarities between Paul and Reinhard. Wars between great houses, the heroic noble becoming a king. Basically, if you like one, you're going to like the other. One thing Paul's got over Reinhard as a character, though, is that he's a far better fighter. He can hold his own against even elite fighters on other worlds. And from what I heard, by the way, the book version of Paul Atreides is so broken that Fade Rotha stands basically zero chance in the original duel. Interestingly, although Reinhard and Paul are similar at first glance, I can actually see more direct similarities between Paul and Julian. Both are young men who take up leadership roles later in the story and become very competent fighters. Both also talk to the Emperor of the Universe, and I will not elaborate for Galactic Heroes. All I'm saying is that if you like Dune, you're gonna love Galactic Heroes, seriously. Both are different takes on space opera, but not so far apart that a fan of one would not like the other. The thing about Galactic Heroes and Dune is that you could very easily see both stories without all the space stuff around them. Dune takes place so far ahead that people have wrapped back around to limiting themselves to knives and have reverted to dueling and gladiator culture. Although that specifically is not in Galactic Heroes, the feudalism is. Both these stories have space feudalism, and as a result, I believe they're timeless. Gentlemanly conduct, or chivalry, honor between men, even of opposing parties, is a big thing in Galactic Heroes. There are a few examples when an Empire character will meet with an Alliance character, and both will be on good terms. The conversation will typically end with good luck on the battlefield. Deals are made, they agree to compromise on issues or grant each other resources and breaks from fighting, but at the end of the day, both know that they're still enemies. Going back to the melee fights, you can still see this between people. One of the Rosenritters, for example, spares an opponent because he's young and doesn't have a girlfriend yet. That's all it takes. And the young guy basically runs, accepting that invitation to live. Both sides have to agree and trust each other for chivalry to really work. And I believe that this sort of chivalry is natural to a degree. If you have respect for, or gain respect for, an enemy, you shouldn't crash out even after losing to them. The relationship between Yang Wenli and Reinhardt demonstrates this. They are only equal to each other, and one relies on understanding the other to crush their enemies. Going back to comparing this to Dune, another big opinion I have is that duels themselves are a natural form of combat. Formal dueling is no longer a thing in our world, but you can still see it when watching certain street fight videos. Some street fights, and I really emphasize the some here, are more like unspoken duels. They have their own codes of conduct. Like, for example, people standing both fighters up if they get to the ground, separating them after it reaches a conclusion even if there's no KO. At some point, both just know that it's over. To have a notion of honor, and a society that allows you to fight for it, is a primal human desire, and it's one that draws people to stories like Legend of the Galactic Heroes and Dune. For example, I watched parts 1 and 2 in theaters, and both duels at the end of both films, the theater went silent. I really think that ritual combat activates some part of the caveman brain. In Galactic Heroes, at least in the original series, you'll never see formal duels, which is unfortunate to me as a martial arts enjoyer. In general, it's much more about tactics and strategy. It's a large-scale show. But both of these stories share the eternal notion of standing up for your honor. Multiple times in Galactic Heroes, admirals will refuse to surrender even though they're guaranteed safety if they give up. And even if everyone calls it a tragedy, these men are still saluted, even by the opposing party, for never giving up. Keep in mind, the show makes a point that there is a difference between being stubborn and being genuinely honorable. You get good and bad examples. Once again, there is another side to this. Someone like Yang Wenli might claim that fighting is useless, but it's clear that constantly running from conflict just ends up with you losing. He has a point that you shouldn't be eager to fight and die, but the plot proves that there is a limit to that. Eventually, you're going to have to turn around and fight. So, once again, the show just imparts very good lifelong lessons, which is also a piece of objectively good fiction for me. Another reason I love Galactic Heroes is because, like Dune, it shows us that across time, conflict just loops back all the way around to being personal and honorable again. So it goes from being personal to being sort of detached, and then back to honorable. Galactic Heroes and Dune, space feudalism in general, presents humanity as existing in a cycle. Its self-expression always circles back to the same structures. We always express our ideas and fight for them in the same way, no matter how long it takes for that circle to close. And that's what makes this genre so interesting to me. I see these things as human nature. They'll never go away, even if we form spacefaring civilizations. And that brings me back to dueling. I mentioned earlier that street fights are a natural form of dueling. Ritual combat and fighting for one's honor is always going to be there in one form or another. I believe that what we're seeing with street fights is a cobbled together, instinctual attempt at dueling. Because although it's not formalized, the human desire for ritual combat is always going to be there. And in my opinion, the fact that we don't have formal dueling actually makes things worse than if there was a system in place, with rules and regulations. I mentioned this before, but there is a way to duel without it resulting in fatalities. And before I talk about this specific example, I will say that a lot of times in the past, you had duels that were just to first blood, not to the death. If you know more about that, let me know in the comments. Now, I mentioned this example in another video, but I'll tell you about it in case you're unfamiliar. I'm going to be talking about Mensur. Mensur was a modified form of fencing found in German fraternities. It developed specifically because university students were allowed to carry swords for self-defense, and you know where this is going. They kept getting into duels that went way too far. The original intention was that these were basically carry weapons. You could defend yourself, your pride or reputation, but the result was usually just completely unnecessary injuries or even death. Students would just pick fights with each other and stake their whole lives on trivial matters. It was not noble, and it was not some grand sort of ideological stand. Most of the time, these duels between students were just stubbornness mixed with social pressure, and that's the exact combination that Galactic Heroes regularly criticizes. This was not fighting for honor, this was just dying for ego. So Mensur was eventually developed as a way to keep the ritual combat while removing the fatalities. Instead of two people trying to stab each other, both participants stood their ground and dueled under strict rules and heavy supervision. They would have a referee, they'd wear protective gear, and they would have designated areas where they could strike. The swords they used were also a specific type. The goal of Mensur was not to win in the traditional sense. It was actually a test of character for both men, and the quote-unquote winner would really just demonstrate their bravery by refusing to flinch or back down, even when cut. So it was a trial by fire, but one that ended up relatively safer than, for example, randomly calling out some kid on the street and then running him through. So you had to have guts to duel in Mensur, but you wouldn't end up spilling those guts on the floor. The scars that these Mensur duelists earned were seen as proof of character, and actually as a measurement of their bravery. The balance was what the earlier duels lacked, and in that sense, it reflects one of the core ideas in Galactic Heroes, that there's a big difference between standing up for something and pushing so hard that it kills you. Yang Wenli understands this because he is really into history. That's one of his main character traits. And other characters like Reinhard and Kircheis deal with this in different ways. Mensur shows that even in our history, there was a way to create a system that preserved dignity and the desire to test oneself through a sort of trial by fire without letting things descend into complete and utter chaos. Human nature never changes, and like our history, it's impossible to stop. Those who seek to stop or even reverse the flow of history, that endless entropy, they are the real villains of this story. Legend of the Galactic Heroes shows us that history always has critical moments, forks in the road where people either choose peace or war, but you have to choose, you can't just stand there. And even if you work towards peace, it's tenuous at best. War, whether it's between two men or 2,000, is inevitable. There's always somebody involved who wants to fight. So as a society, the best thing you can do about this desire to fight, to let out aggression, is find ways to organize and channel it. The society we live in today, where you try to stamp it out completely or hold it back, just makes things worse for our psychology. Politics itself is a form of combat, as the show shows us, but testing yourself in the physical realm is something that you can't really do anywhere else. There is a primal need to do this. No matter how small, men need some form of trial by combat, because we are physical beings. That's why you have characters like Reinhard himself who cannot live without war. In times of peace, he basically starts to wither away, and you see him sort of get weaker. Again, I'm trying to avoid spoilers here, but if you know, you know. So we have proof that people acknowledge that violence can never be stamped out, but it can be shaped. In both the fictional world of galactic heroes, where you have political debates, moral arguments, and even warfare with rules, and in real life, where you had duels that were only to first blood, or even completely separate systems that guaranteed, or at least tried to guarantee, no death. There is a way to do things, and good guys should stick to it. In fact, everyone should stick to it to minimize horrors or atrocities from occurring. In real life, I think we just need to channel our aggression in a way that doesn't destroy wider society. You can never stop war on a big or small scale. Conflict will always exist, and you just have to know how to deal with that. If aggression is like water, previous societies, through forms of mutual combat, or formally organized debates even, created aqueducts for that water. Modern society doesn't really have that in a way that it should, and I think that it's resulted in people just exploding whenever their dams break. Honor is one of those concepts that changes shape depending on the era, but like we've seen with space feudalism stories, it never disappears. Galactic Heroes treats honor like something that's both personal and structural. A person can have honor, and an entire society can have and maintain honor. So, for example, if you're just one person, you can choose to obey or not obey an order, surrender or not surrender, and even it's as small as admitting a mistake. Reinhard von Lohengramm takes his personal honor all the way to the top, and it's what differentiates him from the corrupt nobles. That's the difference between a bad tyrant and a good monarch. And this sort of thing is really what I love about Galactic Heroes. Reinhardt's personal integrity eventually influences the entire universe through his policies, and institutional values can pressure individuals into choices that go against their own sense of honor. Like Yang has to obey his democratically elected leaders in certain instances because he fights for democracy, and even though there are better choices to make, he can't do them if he wants to uphold his values. The story doesn't idealize honor, because like I said, you can think you're honorable, but die when there's no need to, but it doesn't dismiss the idea of honor either. It simply presents it as a constant element in human affairs. Sometimes it makes things better, sometimes it makes things worse, but you can never get rid of it, like you can never get rid of war. By the time you reach the final episodes, Legend of the Galactic Heroes ties all these ideas together. It acknowledges that the wheel of history never stops turning. Power shifts, alliances break apart, new leaders will emerge from out of nowhere, and the tensions that shape the past just keep reappearing. You can't stop it. Without spoiling, Galactic Heroes ending feels ominous because it still recognizes that things can never change. But unlike how Dune Part 2 explicitly ends on a note of doom with the Holy War, Legend of Galactic Heroes says that even if there's no real end to history, tomorrow can still be better. And that's really what makes this one of the greatest anime series of all time. Even if you're just one individual, just one person, your choices might shift history. Everything connects. It's sort of like the butterfly effect. Everything in this story flows. It blends There are many different genres like political drama, military, character study, philosophical debate, and historical commentary into one clean, connecting story. And if you choose, you can separate and look at the different elements for what they are. None of these genres feel out of place. Everything flows because it's like one big ripple effect. You know, someone like Yang's big decision may influence someone like Julian and his small, sort of romantic choices and stuff like that, because he has no time to regret his decisions. Things like that. Ultimately, the point it's trying to make is, how do you act with integrity? How do you try to steer the world into a better tomorrow when you know for a fact that you're just one part of a larger world? The show never answers its own questions. It doesn't hand you an easy solution. Right up until the end, you are expected to understand and answer the questions yourself. It's trying to tell you that even if you can't stop the wheel of history, you can nudge it, even a little bit, towards something better.